And so on. So today's workshop we've got here is Solidarity, Protest and the Law, and the workshop has been hosted by Defend the Right to Protest. This is a national campaign that was launched really in the wake of the police violence that was meted out to students in autumn 2010 when they were protesting against the fees increase, and has since then really developed into a national campaign that organises around the right to protest, also the right to strike and union organisation, and extends solidarity to other groups that fall victim to police violence and racism. And I suppose it's in recognition that really we are in times where people are resisting, but also when people resist, we are having to confront questions of repression of the police, as we've seen, you know, very powerfully in the case of the miners' struggle in South Africa. But it's also premised on the basis that actually, through solidarity, through our resistance, we can overcome these challenges as well. And we hope that this workshop will both enable people to bring the different voices of the way in which they have been impacted on by police violence and criminalisation, but also to discuss seriously how we can build solidarity and take initiatives that provide real support to those different struggles that are taking place. We've got a fantastic lineup, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce people one by one because we are short of time. And I want to start really by introducing Alfie Meadows. People might know that Alfie Meadows was one of those students that was on the demonstration on the 9th of December when MPs voted through the fees increases. There was 30,000 people that attended that demonstration on the day, but they were met with kettles, police charging and batoning, and Alfie was hit so hard on the head that he was almost killed. But in an Orwellian twist of events, Alfie has since been charged with violence disorder. Yes, he has been charged with violence disorder, and he's currently standing trial at the moment at Woolwich Crown Court. So I'd like to welcome up Alfie to talk about his fight and his struggle for justice. A warm
hello, thanks for coming. Just want to say a few words about the student protests. And if you remember the student protests in late 2010, they kick-started the fight back against austerity. They were fighting against the tripling of tuition fees and cuts to EMA. And they were militant protests, mass protests, which included lots and lots of people, not just students, but people in secondary school and also workers and unemployed people. On the protests, we saw a lot of experienced high levels of repression, so the sort of police tactics, things like use of force, lots of violence and kettling, and in the aftermath, hundreds of people were arrested and charged with serious offences. So, as I said, as Hannah said, the Defend the Right to Protest came out of this, but it's very important to make the practical connections between what's happened in the student protest, which was the first round of national resistance to austerity, and what's happening in other struggles. So, firstly, I think I wanted to say, especially because the demo that's going on today against the Israeli bombing of Gaza. In 2009, Gaza demo, there were 70 people who were arrested with violent disorder, which is a public order offence, serious public order offence, which carries a maximum of 5 years in prison. 70 people were arrested, and there wasn't the support, the solidarity, and as a result, many people pleaded, and 60 people pleaded, thinking that they would get community service or that kind of thing, and all went to prison. And it's this experience, I think it's incredibly important, is that firstly it was the precedent which has now been used against the students and can easily be used, the precedent of mass charging of violent disorder, and we saw that in student protests, we also saw it in August uprisings last year, and it also obviously criminalises and creates fear, it's a lot of suffering, and it's so important that there is solidarity to prevent this kind of thing happening. The charge of violent disorder, to use this example, goes back to the 1986, I think it's 1986 Public Order Act, which was brought in in the aftermath of the miners' strike, where they tried to use lots of public order offences, and these often failed. So the basic point is I really think it's important to understand the history of resistance and struggle against the law, to understand this experience and to gain knowledge about it. And I think the knowledge around our legal rights, around the strategies and tactics of people who have struggled in the past is incredibly important, and that's things like legal observing defence groups, collective responsibility for defending people, understanding that it's not an isolated, facing oppression for the law is incredibly isolating and atomising, and it criminalises and breaks up collective solidarities, and that's exactly what we need. We need to look at the history of resistance and struggle against this going forward for the next months and years. It's obvious that effective, sustained political action will face political action against austerity and cuts will face repression, face state repression, and we've seen that obviously in the history of that, the miners' strike in Quebec, the student protests, which was a successful campaign, managed to overturn tuition fees, really defeated neoliberal assaults on people's living life. But even there, 3,000 people arrested. In Greece, obviously, we see the daily violence, police violence. We see fascism and racism really explicitly coming to the fore in the police force. So it's so important that we look at the history of and experiences of resistance against state repression and learn the lessons now. In my trial, we've basically I think it's become incredibly clear, is the police officer who was in command of the student protests. His history is really the history of his experience in policing maps onto the experience of working class resistance against state violence and economic violence over the last 30 years. So he first became an officer in the Brixton uprisings in 1981 and uprisings around the country. He was then in the miners' strike, poll tax, lots of the anti-capitalist demonstrations in around 2000, the police custody demonstrations, and basically the police as the repressive force basically have this history and experience, and they've developed strategies and tactics for confronting resistance, and they really have this history, and they produce all this research and this knowledge and organisation and everything. And I think one thing we need to be doing is we need to be understanding that we have this history of resistance, of fighting back against state repression, and I think that's incredibly important. But the second thing, obviously, is what's our real strength is in solidarity, and that's obviously part of this session, and that's so important. And one of the things coming out for student protests that students have experienced is the massive importance of practical solidarity for people facing oppression, but also understanding how attacks on one are connected to attacks on everyone else. So I think it's essential importance is understanding how police racism is a central part of state repression, has been in the history of state repression against working class resistance in the last 40 years. And it's solidarity is so important that people understand this, and that it translates into actual practice and action. So around deaths in police custody, there was the annual march this year, and people have been struggling so hard against this injustice, and then obviously winning victories and highlighting this issue. But what we need is collective solidarity, and we need to transform we need to help this struggle transform into a mass campaign, because as is obvious, this kind of injustice, violence affects everyone, and I think another really important aspect is the August uprisings last year. I mean, and we've got Carol Duggan here who's going to be speaking about it, I think, but 3,000 people went to prison. And I really think, and this was an example where people could have done more, where the solidarity wasn't perhaps, it didn't happen, there wasn't enough support, people were scared by the media backlash, and but it really is so important, especially, and it's still an issue, and there's people are coming out of prison now, and it's still the kind of solidarity support that people need, and it's so important because, I mean, obviously the August uprising is an incredibly powerful event against racism, police racism, and against state violence and inequality. And if that kind of resistance is united with what we've seen in the student protests and some of the trade union strikes, it's necessary. It's going to be one of the only ways where we can effectively fight back against austerity. So I just want to sum up by saying how important the solidarity and support of trade unions has been for me personally in my campaign, especially PCS and others have supported, and it's made a massive difference. UCU have been incredibly important, and it's going to be key to going forward. So we have the student demonstration on the 21st November. Hopefully it'll be a massive demonstration, but we need the support and solidarity of lecturers and also other trade unionists so that we don't get a repeat of last time. And it's that kind of solidarity and support which will, is the basis for encouraging students and others and community groups to come out and support workers on strike. So solidarity to everyone, and no justice, no peace, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, Alfie mentioned how I think the recent intensification of repression of protests did actually start with the Gaza protesters, and I think that it's always important to recognise when we do win victories, and that actually, although there were a similar number of arrests that took place during the Gaza protests to the student protests, actually in the case of the student protesters, only a third of the number actually ended up having custodial sentences, and I think that's quite significant. Of course, we don't want anyone being sent to prison, but it is quite significant, and I think it is because we did develop a much more effective campaign in defence of the students, and I think that is certainly something that we need to learn from in terms of going into the future. I would really encourage people to do everything they can to support Alfie. The trial is ongoing, there is a public gallery. It's always nice when the officers are up on the stand for them to be looking up and seeing the public looking back at them, especially when you've got people like Nick Johnson, who, as Alfie mentioned, was also in charge of the policing during the G20 protest where Ian Tomlinson was killed in a police kettle, and when he was asked on the stand whether he thought anything had gone wrong during the G20 protest, he said no, absolutely nothing had gone wrong. So clearly the murder of someone on a protest is something that he's entirely fine with. Now, the other thing, I think the question is really about how we build solidarity between different groups fighting back, and in particular, I think between students and trade unionists, and the support for people like Alfie from this trade union movement has been incredibly important, and it's why as a campaign, really we want to make sure that we take up the wider question of attacks on trade union rights, on the right to strike, the victimisation of trade union activists. And so I'm very pleased that we have Dave Smith from the anti-blacklisting campaign to talk about that campaign and the fight against victimisation on cross-railing and other disputes. Over to Dave.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say I'm a trade unionist. That's what I do. I've spent all of my working life trying to improve people's terms and conditions in their workplace so that normal working people have a better life and we have a better society. And I'm a believer in not doing it on your own. We don't change the world by one person doing things. We change the world by people coming together, by doing things collectively, by mobilising. That's how we actually improve things. That's how we actually change things. And nothing I've ever done as a trade unionist is against the law. Far from it being against the law. In fact, it's enshrined in human rights. in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in the European Charter on Human Rights, being a trade unionist is considered to be a basic human right. But not just myself, but many, many other trade unionists across the country know that time after time, if you are successful in mobilising, if you are successful in improving terms and conditions, we end up being victimised, we sometimes end up being sacked, and in the worst cases we end up being blacklisted so that we can't find jobs in the future. And some people may have heard this term blacklisting before, this idea that big companies, you know, check out who we are and stop us getting work in the future, and it does sound like a little bit of a conspiracy theory until you've actually got the documentation. Because some people have heard of this stuff before and some people weren't have, so I'll try and go through it quickly. In 2009, a government department called the Information Commissioner's Office raided the premises of an organisation in the Midlands called the Consultant Association. And when they arrived, they found a database that would have covered these two tables at the front with files about 3,200 trade unionists in the construction industry. And here's a copy of my file. It's 36 pages long. You can get a copy of your own file. And it's basically a forensic following of what I've been up to from the year 1992 to 2005. It's got all of my work history, where I worked, it's got my name, address, national insurance number, what car I drove, when I changed cars, they changed the car registration and that. It's got photographs of me. If I ever wrote a letter or was ever interviewed in the press, that was in there. Is anyone in the room a union safety rep? Come on, show of hands, okay. These are my union safety rep's credentials that was sent to the company to give me rights as a safety rep. It's got the company office stamp on it that they photocopied and then sent it off. So just by being a safety rep was enough to get you blacklisted in the construction industry. And I wouldn't mind it if all they were doing was keeping a scrapbook on me, to be honest. You know, this is quite nice. You know, if someone's interested. But of course, what I actually did was this was set up and run and orchestrated not by small little local managers, but by the biggest multinational companies in the construction industry in the UK. It's Carillion, it's Balfour Beatty, it's Costains, it's Kia, it's BAM, it's Skanska, who built the media centre at the Olympics, it's Robert McAlpine, who built the stadium at the Olympics. And what they did is every time anyone applied for a job, or you turned up on your building site, they checked your name. And every time they checked your name, it cost them money. It started off costing them 50 pence, and by the end of it, it cost them about £2 to check a name. And if your name came up on the list, you were denied work, and you were made unemployed, and you were sacked. And it happened time and time and time again to these 3,200 people. And this is to do with the law. Of course, once we got our forms, we all took loads of cases, took employment tribunal cases. Virtually all of us have lost. Because it doesn't matter that we've got the evidence. They even talk about how they were going to sack me. I took a tribunal against Carillion. They stood up in court and admitted they'd done it. They admitted they blacklisted me. They admitted the reason they did it was because I was a trade union rep and raised health and safety concerns. They admitted that they'd dismissed me. Why did I lose my case? Because British law doesn't protect workers, that's why. British law doesn't protect workers. And because I was an agency worker, and because a lot of us work for subcontractors rather than big multinationals, we're not protected by UK law. So now there's over 100 of us taking a case to the High Court. There's some cases going to the European Court of Human Rights on human rights. Will we win it? Who knows? I've got no idea whether we're going to win it or not. This has been going on for a very long time. But what I want to say is that whether we win in court or not, it doesn't matter. Because what we're about is fighting and getting justice. And a lot of these justice campaigns, they talk about, the victims of the justice campaign were very dignified throughout the entire process. I'll tell you this now, I've got no intention of being dignified about this. They took food off my kids' table. When every other kid in their school was going to bloody Disneyland, we were going to my mum's caravan in Essex. And I bloody take it personal. And I intend to be personal and harass those people. And if they think it's stopped happening, it hasn't happening. There's a fella at the back there, who was sacked off the Olympics because of blowing the whistle on the blacklist. In the select committee, there's a select committee investigation going on in Parliament at the moment, and last week they read out the invoices that were taking place during the building of the Olympics. Sir Robert McAlpine was building the main stadium. They were checking, according to the invoices that they've got, 65 names a day for 7 days a week during the building of the Olympics. Skanska had the biggest invoice. They were invoiced £2.20 every time they checked a name. Skanska's invoice when they were building the media centre on the Olympics was £28,000. That shows you how much blacklisting is going on. It's still going on today because November the 14th on Wednesday was a heroic thing across Europe, and in Britain, you know, where were we doing it? We were doing it in Oxford Street because on Crossrail they're still blacklisting and sacking construction workers, and we're going to keep fighting and keep harassing them and keep going back until we win justice. We're after a public inquiry. I was proud and I was inspired by the speech about Hillsborough, and we're going to do this again and again and again because it's personal for us, and we're going to hound them until we get justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. And I think part of the point about the event today is this is not just about chatting, this is about action as well. And people will see there's a sheet on their chairs, which is some ideas about action coming out of the workshop. And one of them is talking about the daily pickets and protests that we can be part of in support of the demand for the reinstatement of Frank Morris coming out of the Crossrail dispute, and also the details of how you can fund and support the anti-blacklisting campaign. So I would really encourage people to take that back to their workplaces, to their unions, and get involved in mobilising for that. Now, people might have noticed there is someone missing today. You know, Michael Mansfield, who's someone that is well known for representing just causes. Now, he has, as a typical lawyer, he sent me a long letter of apology, which I will just read out a short bit of it, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what he was going to say. So anyway, he says, may I apologise sincerely for my absence. I had the wrong date, which may well entirely be my fault. Note the language there. This weekend has been earmarked for the Hillsborough families whom I'm representing. It's a crucial period as an application is to be made shortly to the High Court to quash the old inquest verdicts and establish fresh inquests. Poignantly, 5 years before Hillsborough, there was an event of significance in the history of the trade union movement, but also in the struggle to preserve the right to peaceful protest. Orgreave. On a hillside just outside Sheffield, hundreds of miners gathered on a warm July day in 1984 to picket a coking plant during the year-long strike against pit closures and the demise of the coal mining industry. The Thatcher government had been planning a confrontation for some time. The Ridley report had mapped out the strategy. The NUM and its leader Arthur Scargill had become the enemy within. It was necessary to break their opposition in order to fashion a compliant workforce. Quite simply, they would be beaten into submission. The agency for this task was the South Yorkshire Police, aided by outside forces under the Mutual Aid Scheme. It provided an ideal opportunity to practice all kinds of tactics being developed at that time. These entailed subjecting vocal but basically peaceful miners to short shield snatch squads, long shield lines of advancing officers interspersed with mounted units charging through and dogs in neighbouring fields. The overall concept was to contain the miners within a hillside field with a railway embankment at the top. The injuries sustained by miners were serious and widespread. One notorious incident was caught on film and transmitted on TV where a miner, Russell Broomhead, was beaten remorselessly by an officer with a truncheon over the head. Another mounted officer was caught swinging his truncheon down towards the head of an independent woman photographer, Leslie Bolton, who had gone to aid a fallen miner. The dramatic incident was filmed by an unseen miner up a tree who watched the snatch squad randomly grab a miner, pin him to the floor in a necklock and drag him through police lines, verbally abusing him all the way. Akin to Hillsborough, the victims were blamed and held responsible by politicians and media alike. For the miners, however, over 90 were charged with one of the most serious offences in the criminal calendar, riot. The trial a year later collapsed during the prosecution case. All miners were acquitted. Their rights have been upheld at huge personal cost. Their sacrifice needs to be recognised and remembered, as well as lessons for those who wish to maintain their legacy of peaceful protest. The main lesson was the ability to demonstrate the fundamental fabrication of evidence that had taken place. This was achieved by the presence of reliable, courageous, independent observers who monitored and recorded the malpractices taking place on the ground. This facilitated cross-examination and the exposure of false testimony. I've long advocated the establishment of a permanent group of observers. Information gathering is now far more sophisticated. Initially, this task was undertaken by the predecessor to Liberty. Whilst they keep a general eye on this area, there is an urgent need for a significant presence on the ground, ready to go into action wherever and whenever needed. It's time for a renewed effort. Resistance has to be organised and it has to be effective. That's a message from Mike Mansfield. And so I'm really pleased that we do have with us today Norman Strike, who was involved in the year-long miners' dispute between 1984-85. He was someone that was arrested, spent a short spell in prison, and was also at Orgreave, involved in the Battle of Orgreave. So I'd like to welcome you, Norman, to say a few words.
Well, it was 28 years ago. Just seems like yesterday, really. It started straight away, the police intimidation. When the young miner was killed in Nottingham in the first few weeks of the strike, David Jones lost his life tragically. My colliery, like lots of other collieries in the country, decided to get a bus full of lads to go down with the lodge banner and go and pay our respects at his funeral. However, as we got to the outskirts of Durham, we were stopped by a huge police convoy, asked us where we were going, and we all had black suits and ties on, and we said we're going to the funeral of the young lad who's been killed. No, you're not. You're going picketing. We're not going picketing, we're going to a funeral. What's that lying down the middle of the bus? I said, it's a bazooka. I had them all off the bus to search the bus. I said, we believe you're going picking, it's against the law, you're not allowed to do it, get back on your bus and bugger off back to where you come from. And they refused to let us go to that funeral. We never went. From that day on, the police intimidation was constant. Whole villages were surrounded by police. The whole county of Nottingham was surrounded by police. You could not get into Nottingham to lawfully picket. And on the one occasion, a very clever young lad from Barnsley managed to get 12 of us in a minibus in to Nottingham by going through, God, we went over every fields and up back lanes, but we got there. And when we got to the colliery, there was 12 of us, and there was about 2,000 policemen at the gate of the pit, and the chief officer came and said, you lot, shut your mouths, stand there, anybody says anything, you'll be arrested. That's your right to protest, that's your right to picket. We didn't have it, they wouldn't let us have it. Orgreave was a setup, I believe. When we got to Sheffield that day, we met outside of the headquarters in Sheffield, and the police marched us to close the motorway off, and the police peacefully, they didn't do anything, they just marched alongside us, and I thought, this is odd, you know, they're actually taking us to the picket line, escorting us, and we went, and when we got there, it was like a scene out of a science fiction film. We came over a railway bridge, we could see lines of policemen all dressed in black with helmets and shields and truncheons, and they're banging on the top. Behind them there was a whole cavalry full of policemen on horseback, and in the field to the side there was policemen with Alsatian dogs. And any time we started to charge in, which was our normal tactic, we'd try and push through the lines to get to do what we want to do, which was to stop the lorries. The lines would part, the horses would come out. If you ran that way, you got bitten by dogs. If you ran that way, you got chased by men on huge horses. And I was a lot fitter in those days. And I remember going up that bloody field, and I could hear behind my head as he was trying to hit me, but he couldn't catch me. I would have beaten Usain Bolt that day. And I got to the top of the field and I just dove over. I didn't know I was over the wall. I just dove over it and tumbled down the embankment. And the cop stood at the top and he was waving his fist at me. I saw lads covered in blood who'd been truncheoned. I saw a lad with the bone sticking out of his leg and they just dragged him. They didn't give him any medical help. They just dragged him behind police lines. And in the paper today, in The Guardian, it's actually said that the South Yorkshire Police, now there's going to be an inquiry into the 91 people who were arrested because, just like Hillsborough, they fabricated their statements. And it's been proved. And they forged the signatures. And all the statements were very similar, as if they'd been written by the same hand. Now, isn't that a surprise that the police could possibly do that? It was terrible what they put us through, but they could not crush our spirit. They could not crush our spirit because we stood together. One of the things I'm really proud of, I'm proud of being the enemy within. I'm proud I took part in that strike. And I'm proud of all the people. I'm proud of all the pickets, I'm proud of all the students, I'm proud of all the workers from all different unions who supported us and sent big vans full of food to help us out when things were getting really tough. I'll tell you another story briefly. When I took my children, I had 2 daughters, and I wanted them to understand a bit what was going on, so I took them to a quiet picket line in the afternoon. And as the buses with the scabs were going in, with their mirrored windows and that mesh, I pointed to the bus and I said to my daughters, girls, inside there, you can't see them because they're cowards, but there's people who are trying to stop and make me go back to work. I just want you to know that. And as we walked away from the picket line, a police van came round the corner and an officer stuck his head out the window with braid on his cap. And he said to me, what did you just say to those kids? And I said, hey, things haven't got that bad. I have to tell you what I'm saying to my own children. And I won't repeat his exact language because we've got children in the room. But he said, well, I'll tell you what, he said, and he swore. He said, I'll tell you what, if those kids get lost, and he pointed at the girls, or something worse happens to them, don't ring for us, ring for Arthur Scargill. And he drove off, and my daughters were really upset. That's the kind of intimidation we had. We had policemen coming into our villages and our towns, name-calling women, and the men would get upset, obviously, because you defend your family, and then the men would be arrested. We've talked about snatch squads. I was at Wearmouth in September 1984, and nobody was doing anything, so come on, we're not going to stand here, let's get on the road, come on! And we all went on the road, and we all formed up, and as we're starting to charge into the police lines, it all went quiet. And what they'd done is they'd sent a snatch squad in, cut everybody off behind me who scattered, and then I was grabbed round the neck, I was arrested, I was taken, I was thrown in a cell, I was taken to court. The magistrate told me I was a danger to the public, I couldn't be trusted, and I was sentenced to 14 days in Durham prison. And they actually took me to Durham prison, where I got the prison uniform, the whole business. It was horrific. Because before the strike, I was salt of the earth, me. Yeah, I was salt of the earth, I was a miner. Then all of a sudden I'm a jackboot thug, and that's what the ruling class tries to do. They try to divide people, they try to split you apart, they try and crush your spirit, but they didn't crush our spirit. They could never crush our spirit, and we fought on to the bitter end. And it's great now, I'm really pleased today at this meeting, in the main meeting, when people are actually talking, don't trust union leaders. The buggers just sit and drink whiskey and champagne and they do nothing. They do nothing. It's you. All of you. You're the union, not them. Yeah. And if they won't do what you want, you do it. Don't trust union leaders. Organise yourselves. The leaflet that's going around, take it with you. Organise. Let's have a fight back in this country like in Greece and like in Portugal and like in Spain. It's time for us to stand up and be counted because this government is wicked and evil and it needs to be. Basically, we're talking about history, we're talking about educating young people, we're trying to make a film about the people, the working class, the rank and file people who went through that strike, not just the miners, the pickets, the women's support groups, the students, the teachers, the factory workers who supported us, to make a film so that young people who are coming through, who've never heard of anything like this, can actually see and hear and watch and listen and learn. So if you're in a trade union, try and get your union to support us with funds, because we need funds to make the film. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, as Norman talked about, it's important to recognise the significance of the way that some of the truth is beginning to come out around Orgreave, around Hillsborough. You know, the scale of contempt with which they treat our site, but also the way in which they're aided and abetted by the other institutions, by the media, by the government to cover up and to get away with it. And I think that the outcome of the recent inquiry around Hillsborough and the way that that's also been linked to what happened in Orgreave, I think it's really important that we recognise that's just the beginning of the campaign for justice for the miners and for the Hillsborough victims as well. There's over 1,400 police or retired police on full pensions that were involved in the Hillsborough disaster, and each and every one of them needs to be stripped of their pensions, needs to be sacked, and needs to be prosecuted and sent to where they belong. Important as well, because as we know, the whole question of police contempt and violence for ordinary people continues, and I think that one of the real scandals about it is the deaths that take place, not just on protests, or the violence on protests, but also on the streets every day, in the backs of vans, in police cells. The scandal of deaths in police custody, 1,443 deaths following police contact since 1990, not a single police officer prosecuted for that. And I can see a number of faces in the room. Doreen, the mother of Ricky Bishop, who was killed 11 years ago. Marcy, the sister of Sean Rigg, who was killed in 2008. And of course we have Carol Duggan here, the aunt of Mark Duggan. And I think that we saw the anger and the rage in the riots last August at the death of Mark Duggan, another black man killed at the hands of the police. But we have to make sure that anger and that rage is actually channeled into an effective and powerful movement that can begin to win some kind of justice for Mark and the other victims of deaths in police custody. So I want to welcome up Carol to say a few words about
First of all, I'd just like to say a quote that I found, and I found it's really appropriate. It's in the most extreme and unjust violation of human rights is premature death through killing. The present government, though, is proving the violation of human rights is not high on their agenda, because it seems the police all over the country have adopted a shoot-to-kill policy. Mark Duggan, my nephew, was on his way home for dinner on the 4th of August, and he was surrounded by 31 police. 11 of them were armed up to the teeth, from having rifles, Glocks to tasers. So they effectively went out to murder Mark that day. They did do that. V53 was the shooter of Mark, and V53 in his statement said he's been on many of these operations. Well, to me, the Metropolitan Police are harbouring serial killers. Yeah. V53 is such a hardcore murderer that after he shot my nephew dead, his main concern was calling his wife to tell her he was fine, to get out of his bloodied clothes and get some food. So where is the importance on life when the police in 2012 are bullying us in the way and taking us off the streets? We went on the Family and Friends United campaign last year in October the 27th, and our banner was stating, let Mark be the last. Mark is not the last. There's been many more since Mark that they have carried on murdering. So I want to know, where is it coming from? Who has given the police the rights to do this? And they've been doing it for years. I did study the miners' strike, by the way, when I studied sociology. So I know exactly the persecution. The police didn't have any serial numbers on them, so they couldn't be identified, could they? So, yes, they are the gang. And yet they are saying that we have many, many gangs on our streets. No, our gangs are our kids who have to walk in numbers to protect themselves. Since Mark died, Mark was a family man. 2 of his children are here because I want them to learn about British justice. Because Kamani, Mark's eldest son, believes that an officer is going to go to prison for murder because he believes in this justice system. I want him to go through this process to make him understand that it's not as clear-cut as that. You've got bad people in every walk of society, every profession. So this is why I have to bring them, because he's going to have a massive downfall when we don't get a conviction, because the police are smearing our family name. They are still out there campaigning against Mark Duggan to prove Mark Duggan was a gangster and he had a gun. We all know different. I was in Manchester, well, I'm from Manchester, and I was in Manchester a couple of weeks back where we had a meeting, Manchester Unity. And this meeting just enabled white people, Muslim people, Caribbeans, Africans to meet on the front line of Moss Side. Not to be defensive, but to be assertive. And that is what we need. We need everybody from every walk of life to join in solidarity against the biggest force, the biggest gang, the police and the government. So
Okay, last but not least, we haven't got Michael Mansfield with us, but we have got a campaigning lawyer, Brian Richardson, who's been involved in representing the students, people involved in the riots as well. So, Brian, over to you.
Sisters and brothers, I'm sure many, most probably all of you, are disappointed that it's me, not Michael. Hannah says last. Hannah says last but not least. I think she's being generous to me on that score. And I do actually just want to say this to begin with. I was at a meeting with Michael on Thursday evening. It was the annual meeting of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. Michael is genuinely and sincerely disappointed that he can't attend today. He made that clear at that meeting, as well as at that time urging as many people as possible to come along to today. And that is, I think, a measure of his recognition of how brilliant the work of Defend the Right to Protest has been in supporting and encouraging various campaigns. There have been a number of themes that have come across in the plenary session this morning and in this workshop already this afternoon, and I just want really to pick up on a couple of those points, and in that sense, so So what do you need me to do? Turn it on. I just want to pick up on a couple of those things. The first thing, obviously, is that, as has been discussed already, this government is driving through an absolutely savage austerity programme, a savage programme of cuts which will destroy working class lives up and down the country. And in order to drive through that programme, they have to discredit and destroy any resistance that stands in their way. And in order to do that, they will mobilise the full force of the law and they will use the ownership and control of the press by their allies in order to drive through that programme, to propagate their ideas. But nevertheless, we have to resist. We have to mobilise as much resistance as possible. Alfie talked about how the Public Order Act is being used to prosecute him and his fellow Zach in the courts at the moment. And we've heard where the Public Order Act came from. It was introduced in 1986 in the immediate aftermath of the miners' strike. No surprise there, because the government at that time, the Tory government at that time, was determined to crush working class resistance in order to drive through a savage programme of cuts. And so, having taken on the miners and see just how determined Norman and his comrades in the miners were to fight back, to defend their communities, to defend their families, to fight for their livelihoods, the government was determined to mobilise the full force of the law to try and crush the spirit and crush the resistance of working class people. So it is no coincidence that they introduced the Public Order Act in 1986 to regulate their control over working class people. Dave said that the British law doesn't protect working class people, doesn't protect workers. Well, we have heard from the other people on the platform that it doesn't protect people like Alfie, students who are fighting for their livelihood, fighting for their future. Instead of supporting and defending them, it prosecutes and takes them through the courts. We've heard from Norman that people who were fighting for their livelihood were described as the enemy within. That's how they were characterised by the Thatcher government. People like the Duggan family, the Rigg family, whose loved ones have died at the hands of the police and in police custody, they're not protected by the law. They don't receive justice. Therefore, what do we do? Is it worth us fighting? I'm, as has been said, a lawyer, and I've represented people who've been involved in the student protest, some of the people who have been dragged through the courts in relation to the riots. And the truth is that we, as lawyers, win occasional victories. The odd client is acquitted of violent disorder. The odd client is acquitted of one of these public order offences. But more often than not, we don't win those cases. We've heard about the thousands of people who have been dragged through the courts. On the question of the riots alone, I have been reliably informed by a prosecutor that not only, and people will remember that in the immediate aftermath of the riots, the courts were open 24 hours processing people who were first arrested. That and again, have this on good authority, that a diktat was sent around to the courts not to allow people to have bail, but to remand them in custody ahead of their sentencing. People who have been sentenced have been given exemplary sentences in relation to the riots, and the decision of the appeal courts was quite literally to say that the context in which the riots took place meant that the courts could rip up the sentencing guidelines and impose exemplary sentences on the people in relation to the riots. And so therefore the law, we win the occasional victory, but more often than not, when individuals are dragged through the courts, they're dragged through the courts as individuals, they are intimidated, their spirit is crushed, they're convicted, and they're thrown in prison where they are further isolated. Does that mean it's not worth fighting? No. We mustn't allow them to crush our spirit. In terms of the demonstration that is taking place with the students, we don't want people to think, well, this is what's happening to Alfie Meadows, I'm not going on the student protest. Actually, we need to redouble our efforts, going back to the students' unions and saying that as many students as possible need to be on those demonstrations. And there need to be as many trade union banners there as possible. But let's think about the victories that we have won. You know, think about what happened to the miners. And one of the things that Norman could have mentioned was this, when we talk about how they use the full force of the state against working class people, that demonstration, the news bulletins the night of the Battle of Orgreave, showed the pickets, the miners, attacking the police. And it looked, therefore, as if the police had come under a ferocious attack and had defended themselves. That was what was shown on the national news bulletins. The truth was, wasn't it, Norman, that they reversed the footage. They reversed the footage of what happened, because in actual fact it was the police who had attacked the pickets. That has been exposed because people properly filmed it, because people put their testimony forward. Let's think about a couple of the other things that have happened that we've already heard about this afternoon. Bloody Sunday. The Bloody Sunday inquiry. 40 years ago, Bloody Sunday took place. A couple of years ago, the truth that those people suffered an injustice, the people who were protesting to defend their rights in Derry at Bloody Sunday, those people suffered an injustice. Hillsborough. We've heard about Hillsborough. The official story of Hillsborough was that Liverpool fans were drunk, had caused their own death, had urinated on people who were dying, and had stolen from the pockets of people who were dead. That was the official story in the Sun, on the news bulletins in the aftermath of Hillsborough. The reality has come out in the last few weeks that those people died because of the criminal negligence of the state. Why have those truths come out? Those truths come out because the people who were the victims of Bloody Sunday and of Hillsborough, the families of those loved ones, refused to lie down, refused to allow them to and they campaigned for decades to get justice. What I'm saying in short there, it wasn't the brilliance of lawyers in court. There were brilliant lawyers, Michael Mansfield amongst them, who finally, when those inquiries were held, were able to tell the stories of what really happened. But those stories came from ordinary people themselves, who had organised, who got together, who refused to give up, and who had demanded justice. The same, of course, is true of the Lawrence family. David talked about the family of Stephen Lawrence. David talked about how people are talked of as being wonderfully dignified. Well, the Lawrence family were not being described as a dignified family by the Daily Mail in 1993 when Stephen had died, and they were turning to campaign groups to say we want to expose the reality of the police behaviour. The Lawrence family were being vilified. They were being described as militants. They were being denounced for turning to extremist groups to help them. That family, nevertheless, refused to give up. They refused to allow that injustice to be perpetrated. They wanted to expose the fact that Stephen wasn't a gang member who must have caused his own death, as the police believed when Stephen died. They wanted to expose the fact that when the police claimed that there had been a wall of silence about Stephen's death, that was a lie, that they had been told literally within hours of Stephen's death how he had died and who had been responsible for his death. And so we have won landmark victories in the last couple of years. Not justice for those families, not real justice for the Hillsborough victims, not real justice for the families of in Bloody Sunday, not real justice for the family of Stephen Lawrence. Stephen Lawrence is never going to come back, so that will never be real justice. But the fact that they've managed to expose the institutional racism at the heart of the Metropolitan Police, the fact that finally, 19 years after Stephen's death, they managed to get 2 of his killers convicted and put behind bars, shows what can be achieved when people campaign, when people organise, when people refuse to give up. And I do want to say this in terms of bringing things together. The Lawrence family campaigns acknowledgement of the support that they received up and down the country from ordinary working class people is a matter of public record. Neville Lawrence said that when they didn't know where to turn to for support, for solidarity, for practical financial support, it came from the trade union movement. Neville spoke at the Trade Union Congress, and the Trade Union Congress agreed to financially underwrite and support the Lawrence Families campaign. Why did that happen? It happened because people identified with the Lawrence campaign. People in Hillsborough identified with the Lawrence campaign because they knew that when the Lawrence family talked about the police and corruption, that's what they'd experienced. Miners supported the Lawrence family when they talked about the police and corruption because that's what they'd experienced. In other words, the common experience that they had themselves was one that meant that they could identify with the Lawrence family. And therefore, the message of solidarity is the key, I think, message that needs to come out of the conference. That those victories that we have achieved, those small victories that we have achieved, have come about because people have stood together. And it's standing together that we will begin to win the victories that we need to win if we are going to push back this government. It therefore means, I think, practically, as people have said, supporting the individuals like Alfie and Zach who are going through the courts at the moment so that they don't stand alone as individuals. It means supporting those people, the people who rioted are rioting against the same misery and austerity that the students campaigned and demonstrated over, that people struck in June and November of last year over. It's part of the same system that is trying to crush all of us, and therefore we have to support the students. We have to support the people who are being dragged through the courts over the riots. We have to support all of the families who are campaigning against the cover-up of deaths in custody. The Rigg family are here. I'm sure they will speak brilliantly and with passion. It means supporting the trade unionists who are fighting to expose the blacklisting that they experience, and it means supporting every single strike, demonstration and struggle that takes place against this rotten government and its disgraceful austerity programme.